The U.S. military has hundreds of thousands of forces based around the world, which the Pentagon refers to as our forward presence, also known as posture. Earlier this year, President Biden directed the Pentagon to conduct a review of this posture.
This review will help inform the Secretary's advice to the Commander-in-Chief about how we best allocate military forces in pursuit of our national interests.
The decisions made in this review will have consequences for two critical areas: how the Pentagon equips itself to achieve the country's military ends, but also how the U.S. government organizes itself to achieve its broader foreign policy goals, particularly as they pertain to U.S.-China competition. And as things stand today, the government might have some work to do. Let's start with our forward presence.
Forward presence isn't going to be sufficient to address all of the types of threats that the United States might face, particularly given the rise of cyber and the vulnerability of the homeland to cyber threats, which don't need to go through our ships and planes and large combat units at all.
And yet, in its last budget submission, the Pentagon allocated 10 times as much money to ships and planes and large combat units as it did to cyber. Why the gap? Yes, cyber capabilities are cheaper, but a more significant reason has to do with how the military is organized and, consequently, how it thinks about threats.
The way that cyber in the military works now, there are specialists in cyber within each of the services, in the Army, in the Air Force, in the Marines, in the Navy.
But simply adding cyber specialists to the ranks of the four services inhibits the Pentagon from treating cyber warfare like air and naval warfare, domains in their own right. This means the services continue to ask for, and the government continues to provide, what are called legacy platforms, the ships and planes and tanks one sees on bases at home and abroad. This thinking crowds out other new forms of warfare too, like what the Pentagon calls information operations, the use of propaganda and mis- and disinformation against an adversary, a method of particular salience in Asia.
This notion of, our military tracking what's going on in the information environment, the fact that what's going on online has real ramifications for force protection, for maneuver, for the actual execution of operations, I think that understanding is almost entirely absent, when in fact it will be crucial when we're talking about this theater.
When it comes to change, the Pentagon is its own worst enemy.
I'm an organizational psychologist. I spent 4 years on the Defense Innovation Board, and I've also spent time teaching leadership to generals and admirals and doing research on military bases. I have deep admiration for our service members and DoD civilians. I also worry that DoD's culture is a threat to national security.
And it's because the Department of Defense is such a big bureaucracy. It has so many layers that are invested in the systems that we have today.
The Pentagon needs to wrestle with how it understands and equips itself for future wars. But there is an even more foundational issue at work: how the Pentagon came to own so many of the challenges the U.S. faces in Asia, and how those challenges came to be seen as threats.
Much of the Obama administration's pivot to Asia was really about economics. It didn't get understood that way, but it really was primarily about economics. But when President Trump was elected, he killed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So what that effectively did was take any sort of economic cooperation against China out of the US toolkit. So what are you left with? When your big economic and trade initiative goes away, what are you left with? Well, that's the military, that's security, So it doesn't surprise me that our response in the Asia Pacific, we always had a danger of it being focused too much on the military because that's what the United States is over-invested in. But you take away what had been the linchpin of US economic cooperation in the area with nothing to succeed it, and it doesn't surprise me that you get more focus on the defense, on the national security aspects of the relationship, because you took away the biggest other international piece of it, which is economic cooperation.
As the Pentagon's organizational structure skews the way it thinks about the changing face of warfare, so too does the U.S. government's habitual over-reliance on the Pentagon skew the way the government views the challenges it faces around the world, and the other tools of statecraft it might use to meet them.
In the United States, unfortunately, we do not fund the arms of government equally in all of those areas. right? We end up turning to the Department of Defense because, it's the $800 hammer in our toolkit, right? Whereas everybody else is, living on budget dust in comparison. So the United States government is not set up to address this effectively. And so more and more of that gets put on the Department of Defense.
The Global Force Posture Review needs to address one very particular question.
How do you deter threats that do not involve conventional large-scale violence?
The Biden administration needs to answer a bigger question. Which among America's vital national security interests are truly the Pentagon's to own? Merging the answers to these two questions would spark some long overdue change, not just for how the Pentagon fights, but where and why the nation calls on it to do so. The Global Force Posture Review is a critical piece, but it's just the beginning.